Chapter 29. Untimely. They all hanged by their necks, with fishing lines so thin that Parrish thought they were only floating before the realization sunk in. Jordan just stood there, staring at the empty husks, once full of life but no longer so. Could he have saved them? Maybe in a perfect world. In a dimension where he was better at being a harbinger of death. Perhaps he could have had the vision a tad earlier to prevent their untimely demise. Parrish? He finally remembered to breathe when he heard her voice. Fisher was still alive, but for how long still, he thought. At last, his eyes were able to move away from his already lifeless colleagues, allowing him to further inspect the room. He picked up on a door's presence that he wasn't entirely sure had been there before, but what was the need to ponder on such questions at that point? He walked forward once his legs finally obeyed his intention. Fisher? He settled for finding his partner for that time being, answering questions such as where he truly was or how to get out of there became a secondary quest. I'm right this way. It seemed he was heading in the right direction, getting closer to the source of those words, so he picked up in speed and began to run towards it. The hallway he was racing through was just as dark, narrow, and everlasting as the one he traversed before. He kept on going forth as she cried out for him a few more times, each call closer sounding than the previous. His tension wasn't easing, and he seemed to have ditched all efforts to be wary by then, ready to jump headfirst into whatever situation was awaiting. Parrish, help! He instantly dug his heels into the ground when he realized that something was wrong with her voice, or tone, with her presence in general. It sounded like Fisher, but also unlike her at the same time. Good thing was that he'd already believed in the supernatural, otherwise he'd have been a good candidate for losing his mind over that. The idea of backtracking crossed his mind, but the soft whispers faintly chirping around him, mixed with disturbing sorts of low giggles, discouraged him from making any movement. He knew by then that it was already too late. He slowly turned around to look behind himself, only to be met with a solid wall. A wall that undoubtedly was not there. It was a corridor. He'd come from that way. There was no reason for him to see a wall there instead. His anxiety and fear upgraded to unimaginable levels of aggravation in this moment. He thought it was ironic, more than anything really. He thought that predicting other people's deaths was the most dreadful feeling he'd ever endure. Internally laughed at that right then, because in any case, predicting his own death took the cake for him. He was going to die, and so much sooner than he'd expected. At the hospital. You're 100? Lydia lost her words. 156. You heard it correctly the first time. The moment of silence that followed the Banshee's conversation was broken by Melissa as she entered the room. She immediately spoke up. How are you feeling, girls? All right, Lydia simply answered. So you're Melissa McCall. Well, that's me. And, you're the new Banshee. That short interaction set awkward vibes for everyone, with the exception of Mei Li, who seemed comfortable Come to think of it, her demeanor barely changed throughout her entire discussion with Lydia. I heard you were most likely the reason why everyone on that bus is alive, so thank you. Melissa felt she was blurting out her words she thought were appropriate to break the ice. Well, I didn't do it to be a saint. They die, I die too, eventually. Lydia glanced at Melissa, unsure how to react in front of Maylee's blatancy and overall social skills. How is everyone doing? She finally managed to ask. Well, apart from Theo, everybody affected by the Scorpion Men seems to have recovered. Was Stiles also injured by them? No, he wasn't, but... But what? Lydia frowned. He should have been up by now. He should have been? So he's not? Asked Lydia, suspicious. No, he's not, confessed Melissa. Lydia immediately turned towards the door, but before she could step further away from the bed, she felt a strong grip on her wrist. What are you doing? Let go, please, she demands from Malia. We're not finished here yet. I'm going to need you. My boyfriend needs me. She made sure to articulate those words as clearly as possible, as if that would convey her message better. He'll be fine. That statement both infuriated and comforted Lydia. From one side, she was enraged at Maylee's casualness and carefreeness about the subject, but on another side, however, that confidence was what comforted her. She knew Malia had her reasons for acting that way. She just hoped it'd be good reasons. Just trust me on this. If I'm right about this, there's no other place you'd rather be but here. For the time being, at least. Your friends' lives may depend on that. Chapter 30. Nowhere Land. Where did all that quietude fall from, all of a sudden? It was provoking, infuriating not to know what was brewing behind the scenes. Not that Stiles missed that monster's voice. In fact, he'd do well without ever having to hear it again. The young man knew, however, that he wasn't in the clear still. He struggled to pull his own weight, which forced him to rely on the steadiness of the walls around him, his hands gliding along the surface, left and right, each at their turn, in order to expedite his body forward. His eyes finally landed on a sign, above a double-doored exit, validating his sentiment of progress-making. The relief was short-lived in any case. When he was close enough to actually read the sign, he realized it didn't exactly say exit, but X-E-I-T. Stiles felt his blood freeze in his veins. Then a burning sensation began to arise in the pit of his stomach, quickly followed by a bitter taste reaching the back of his throat. Think you're dreaming, Stiles. Despite his queasiness, he fought back the urge to vomit right there. He ignored the throbbing in his head and pushed past the plea of his sore muscles as he doubled his efforts to reach the doors. Because although the voice was far-sounding, after the miles of the interminable hallway he left behind him, he still didn't want it to gain any distance on him. He could hear it giggle, then laugh, then giggle again. It didn't sound worried the slightest about letting him get away. Stiles sweated his way to those gates. practically throwing himself onto them once he felt they were realistically close enough. He expected to be struck by harsh lights, but none of that was. Instead, darkness greeted him with open arms. He squinted his eyes, trying to adjust his sight to the newfound obscurity. He felt the weak breezes of cold air graze his skin. They carried a woodsy fragrance, along with the scent of damp moss on a grassy earth to his nose. He knew he was standing in the middle of a forest, according to those hints alone. Good old times. I spent a few years in this stupid tree trunk, like a second home to me. One could hear a hint of nostalgia in that demon's voice. One could fall for the ruse if they didn't know that trickery was a full-fledged piece of kitsune's. And worst of them all, nogitsuné's. Chaos and strife being their main nutrition sources. Stiles could finally view his surroundings. The tree trunk that the nogitsuné was talking about was none other than the nematon. Doesn't it feel like home to you, Stiles? He adopted a more of a mocking tone when he said that. Stiles didn't say a word. He settled for breathing in all of the oxygen he could take. He seemed almost afraid there wouldn't be enough to keep him alive. Why the long face? Not happy with something? Reasons for me to be happy? Stiles had unglued his lips and articulated his tightly clenched jaws to begrudgingly utter those words. Well, beggars can't be choosers. One minute it sounded like the voice was coming from behind him, then the other. It sounded like it was speaking to him from the front. He began to frantically look around himself, trying to catch a glimpse of his foe, but an echoey voice was all it was. Or so it seemed. On the road. This stupid night is really very long. Malia heavily struggled to push those words out of her throat as she groaned in pain. She slowly craned her neck and looked in her father's direction. He seemed to regain his consciousness at the same time as her. I think Peter brought his hand up towards the warm liquid pooling on his forehead, then took a look at his red-stained fingers, which confirmed that he was bleeding. Malia carefully unbuckled her seatbelt while pushing on the top of the car with a remaining free hand to prevent herself from falling on her head. The car was upside down, after all. She then slowly turned to the side in order to kick the door off its hinges at a better and more advantageous angle. As soon as she crawled outside, she felt a strong hand tightly grab her by the throat, slowly crushing her windpipes and lifting her off the ground. She was finally at eye level with a berserker attempting to snuff her out of life. He flailed and thrashed her legs around as she desperately gasped for air to breathe. Right when her sight grew blurry, she felt a great mass smashing into both her and the berserker holding her up, and the three bodies were sent crashing to the ground with force. Peter rushed towards his daughter the moment he stood back on his feet, gently but hastily tugging on her arm. He'd thrown his entire body weight on the monster to wrench her out of its grip. "Malia, come on, we need to get out of here," he tried to help her up. They limped as fast as they could to take refuge in the thickness of the forest between the trees. "It's not alone," Malia stated in her panting. "Somebody brought them here," added Peter. "Where is here? What the hell is this place anyway?" "I don't know about that, but I only know of one creature that can control berserkers," Peter said before they heard another low growl coming at them up front. They stopped and switched to running in another direction. "You think she's back?" Know of any other were-jaguar? Peter threw out. We better keep on running for now. This is ridiculous. This is the second time tonight. Peter whined as they attempted to find their way out of that long night. Chapter 31. Memorii. Walking in the dead of night, he was attentive to every noise, every creaking crack, and every quivering leaf. Best be mindful, best be acute, when one walked out, way past twilight, under the murky sky. Yet, and with that in mind, Derek knew he was believably marching straight into a trap. Into her trap. Jennifer Blake. A real nasty woman she was, if one could call her a woman at all, not after all the monstrosities she'd committed. He couldn't settle on the idea of knowing she was roaming his town freely, alive. No, the cold sheets on that hospital bed burned his skin the moment he heard her name from Lydia's lips. Still unsure of what the whole picture or map looked like, not sure where he was precisely supposed to go, but he thought, he believed he should head to where Jennifer Blake's entire chapter began. The reasons that pushed her to go from Julia Beccari, an average emissary, to, well, her, Jennifer Blake, the Dorak. That sound on his left, the deep but soft hooting of an owl, probably calling out for a potential mate. To his right, nothing more than the whistling of winds through the dense forest. Nothing to ruffle his feathers about. So he kept flashing his eyes forward and put one foot in front of another. As he drew closer to his destination, his focus fell back on her, on how he didn't even want to imagine what she was plotting, but really had no choice about it. He had to face her anyhow. He thought that if anyone should do it was him. Derek broke his motion pattern once he saw the building in his prospect, the distillery he used to often frequent in his youth. He stood for a moment, just taking that still image in, wondering what he hoped to accomplish there after reaching that place. His eyes then drifted from the highest point of that old construction down towards a distinct marking on one of the walls. It was a symbol, the sign for vendetta known amongst werewolves. Anus had carved it there in a fit of rage on the day of his last meeting with the other alphas of Beacon Hills. Peter had witnessed the entire scene. The gathering was in many ways a kickstarter of many unfortunate turns events. It still reeked with the foul stench of blood, Derek noted upon entering the abandoned establishment. But against all odds, it wasn't the memories of all and every violent occurrence that he had to face in that place that came forth to the surface. It was the gentle and sweet sound of music he could never forget, no matter how hard he could try. Not that he ever tried to, though. The beautiful notes played by his first love, Paige. She brought to life some magnificent pieces with the power of her gifted hands. Paige was the only girl to have ever truly loved him. She definitely was, considering his luck with women after all. Even in her last moments, she made sure to let him know how much she loved him, for who and what he really was. She assured him she wasn't taking any grudges with her to the afterlife, towards him for the part he played in her end at such a young age. "You're gonna make me jealous, Derek." At the sound of her cursed voice, he immediately shut his eyes, then pinched the bridge of his nose to stop two little teardrops from escaping. "How long has it really been?" Not long enough, he barked back. So, you didn't miss me? Is that what you're trying to say? Derek. She mocked. Who in their right mind would miss someone like you? You have the gall to be speaking like that at all, after you just stood there and watched them kill me? Jennifer sounded more aggressive when she uttered those words. You weren't exactly innocent yourself, he retorted. I did what I needed to do to survive, just like everyone else. She had recovered her calm tone. No, you did survive. That was not the problem. It was what you did after surviving that is a problem. By the way, why are you keeping your eyes shut? Were you so disgusted by the sight of my slashed face that you don't want to take the risk of seeing it again? Derek didn't even realize it until she pointed it out, except she got the reasons for him closing his eyes wrong. He guessed it was just a reflex after the Anuk-ite used her voice to trick him. Unlike what she assumed, he never thought much of her damaged face. He never even really had the time to. Those superficial thoughts were always immediately overshadowed by her disgusting actions. You ever wonder that what could have happened if you just came back to Beacon Hills and didn't go about your revenge the way you did? He'd loosened the tension around his eyelids when he said that, but he still kept them closed. Because you think I would have gotten your attention without the power that the first sacrifice gave me? Really, Jennifer? Should I remind you of the day we met and the reason things happened the way they did? He hated to admit it, but his voice did soften when he spoke that last sentence. Yeah, you could remind me of that, but why don't you take a look at me first? He sounded little and brittle at those words. Derek decided to grant her that wish, if it was ever her last. He slowly forsook the darkness behind him and accepted the colors of the world around him again. First, he saw her feet, and her legs, her waist, her chest, and finally, her face. And the smile she displayed seemed too genuine for someone with a tainted soul such as hers. Chapter 32. New face. The lights flickered above her head, and they did so again and again and again. Rosalie sat up on her bed, transfixed, watching the lamps go on and off for what felt like an eternity. She used her right arm to push herself to stand up. She grimaced as her entire body weight rested on nothing more than her still weak legs. Slowly trudging towards the door, she gripped the knob and cautiously twisted it, sneakily peeking at the hallway. It was suspiciously quiet. Sure, it was indeed a very late hour, but still she expected to see some staff members at the very least. Noticed, to her dismay, that the flickering was not a malfunction exclusive to the lights in her room. The knot in her stomach grew larger, and her mouth got drier as she realized that her fears were funded. She groped the walls to help herself move along. Her destination clear in her mind, she made progress at a steady pace, and she almost reached the elevator when she remarked a buzzing sound coming from the light straight above her. It was significantly louder than the one emanating from the others. She carefully lifted her head to investigate the source, but immediately, and upon sight, she regretted her decision to do so. Her eyes widened. All her facial traits mobilized together in the efforts of displaying one single expression, that of sheer terror. When her view landed on the horde of flies, seemingly almost clumped together, fluttering at only a few feet above, they had even managed to cloak the light because of their broad number. Rosalie refused to waste another second on the spot. Her breath quickening, she advanced forth as fast as her body state allowed her to. Upon finally reaching the elevator door, she impatiently and repeatedly pushed the button to call the steel cage to her level, desperate to leave that floor. Going somewhere? She paused, finger grazing the dial. She held her breath and remained petrified. On the closed gray metal doors in front of her, Rosalie could vaguely distinguish a human silhouette standing at a mile distance away behind her. From the look of it, "You know who I am, don't you, Rosalie?" He spoke again. His low, gravelly voice extended to her ears. The blare of it was blasphemous, wickedness and vileness oozing through his teeth. With that, he perfectly conveyed the feeling of threat he intended to. "I know we haven't met before, but I heard a lot about you. You know, I really am a big fan of your little team." He kept on talking, taunting and mocking her all the way through. When the elevator failed her and refused to obey, she finally accepted that she had no other choice but to resort to facing him. And so she did. She slowly turned his way. Once her eyeballs were on his figure, she quickly assessed his form and concluded that she'd simply never seen him before. Yet she knew quite well who he was, or what he was. He appeared as none more than a young man, from Japanese descent by the look of him. Deep dark circles weighing his under eyes down. His exaggerately pale skin faintly cracked due to the torturous smile he insisted on squeezing out. "They set you free again." Her shaky voice cracked as she uttered those words. "Well, yeah, it's nice to walk the earth again." "Why are you here?" she asked in the same tone, though somewhat louder than before. "Oh, I have some unfinished business to tend to under this roof. Don't worry, I'm not here for you, though." He paused for a while, and spoke again. "Not yet." His smile grew somehow wider at the end of that sentence. It sent a chill down her spine. Fortunately for her soul, she heard the elevator sing and the doors behind her open. She regained a sliver of hope as she shoved her body inside. As they were closing, however, she could swear she caught a glimpse of multiple dark shadow figures appearing out of thin air. She didn't catch any more details about them as her focus fell back on him. He stood in place, unmoved. The only part of his body that did so was his arm that he lifted up in a slow motion in order to wave a creepy and unsettling goodbye to her, his face frozen in time.